Hey guys, tonight we journey into the soggy, turnip-studded fields of medieval Europe. You're wrapped in a coarse wool cloak, the kind that smells vaguely of damp goat trudging ankle-deep through sticky brown muck as a pale mist slinks across the land. Your boots, if you can even call them that, are little more than leather sacks, and they squelch with every reluctant step. Somewhere nearby, a sheep coughs. Welcome to farm life in the Middle Ages. You're cold, you're damp, and frankly, you're hungry, but don't get too excited. Because tonight's menu, it's mostly turnips. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You bend down and yank one of the stubby vegetables from the soil. It's a little bulbous thing with pale skin and purple shoulders, nothing glamorous, just a turnip. This lumpy root was the backbone of medieval peasant diets, especially during the long, brutal winters. There's no applause when you dig one up, no fragrance wafting toward your nose, just a damp crunch and a slight smell of earth and cabbage. Still, it was survival. No one in the 13th century was asking. But is it keto turnips were boiled, mashed, occasionally fermented, and sometimes just eaten raw out of desperation? Historians still argue whether they were primarily a crop of last resort or simply misunderstood due to modern taste preferences. But what's certain is this: when grains failed and meat was scarce, red always turnips were what kept whole villages from slipping into famine. And they weren't just tossed into stews. Oh no, medieval cooks, often mothers, widows, or monks with far too much free time, experimented. A turnip pie was not unheard of. Add some herbs, maybe a little onion if you were lucky, and voila, a dish that no one asked for, but everyone ate anyway. In Scotland, they were lovingly called nups. In France, navettes. And in England, they were usually called œufs. You pass a cluster of children using dried turnips as makeshift balls, kicking them through the slop with muddy toes. It's not exactly FIFA, but hey, it's entertainment. In many regions, leftover turnips were carved into crude faces, not for Halloween, mind you, but to scare off birds and wandering spirits. Imagine waking up to a frost-covered field of smirking root vegetables and trying to take your life seriously. Still, there's something humble and admirable about the turnip's role. It was dependable, hardy, the kind of crop that didn't demand good weather or perfect soil, just a patch of ground, some water, and a bit of neglect. And in return, it gave sustenance year after grueling year. A fringe tidbit from Welsh folklore even claims that turnips absorb the dreams of the people who grew them, whatever that means. Sweet dreams indeed. As you walk past the fields, your nose catches a sour smell drifting from a large wooden barrel. Fermented turnip mash, possibly used as animal feed, or if you were unlucky, special occasion soup. Some monasteries even brewed a kind of turnip beer. Yes, really, it wasn't very alcoholic and certainly wasn't good, but it was wet, and that counted for a lot. You duck into a tiny hut. The ceiling is low and the smoke from a hearth curls like a lazy snake above your head. A woman stirs a bubbling pot of thin turnip stew while a child picks bits of dirt off one of the floating lumps. She offers you a taste. You pretend to be grateful. The taste is, well, it's warm. That's about all it has going for it. But in a time when spices meant salt, if you were lucky, and protein meant chewing on old bread crusts, this was fine dining. A short, stocky man hobbles in carrying a sack slung over one shoulder. He dumps out a dozen freshly harvested turnips and mutters something about the mold again. You notice that several of them are tinged black around the roots. Mold was a constant enemy, especially in damp underground storage pits. Yet peasants rarely threw out food. They'd just cut around the rot and call it a day. Some wealthier households treated turnips with a bit more ceremony. Okay? In 14th century manorial records, turnip greens are mentioned as side dishes for spring feasts. That's right, the leafy tops you probably discard were once the height of culinary sophistication for people who hadn't discovered arugula, and believe it or not, turnips were sometimes used in medicine. Ground into poultices, they were slapped onto bruises, infected cuts, and once allegedly a broken heart. A medieval herbalist's guide from Germany recommends stuffing turnips with crushed garlic and applying them to the soles of the feet to cure melancholy of the spleen. No, we don't know what that is either. Outside, the rain picks up again. You hear it tapping gently on thatched roofs and plinking into wooden buckets. A chicken wanders by, unimpressed with your tour. You crouch and dig your hands back into the soil. There's a sense of quiet resilience here of life, built one root at a time in the face of war plague, and the kind of weather that makes you question your choices. So next time you glance at a turnip in the supermarket and turn up your nose, remember this. It may be boring, bland, and slightly damp smelling, but it helped humanity scrape through centuries of hardship. You rise from the muck brush off your hands and trudge forward. There are stranger vegetables waiting just ahead. Your fingers are still stained with the muddy memory of turnips as you shuffle along a narrow cart path, the mist curling tighter now, like a wet wool scarf around your neck. A low stone wall lines the field ahead, and beyond it, rows of plants rise with just a bit more elegance. Taller, slender, and with delicate white blossoms nodding in the breeze. You climb over the stones and kneel down. These aren't carrots. At least, not exactly. They're parsnips, often mistaken for their orange cousins. But in medieval Europe, they had their own quiet prestige. You pluck one free and run a thumb along its pale, ridged body. It smells sweet, oddly floral, with a hint of earth. Before sugar became widespread in Europe, long before tropical canes were boiled and refined into indulgent crystals, parsnips were one of the sweetest things you could eat that didn't fly or grow on a tree. They caramelized beautifully when roasted over a fire, and you might say they were medieval Europe's guilty pleasure, though without the guilt. Or the pleasure depending on how hungry you were. In medieval cookbooks, or what passed for cookbooks, scraps of vellum with ink-blotted lists, parsnips show up in broths, pies, and purees. They were sometimes served mashed with honey and herbs, especially on feast days. One particularly daring recipe from 14th century England involved parsnips, almonds, and something translated vaguely as mock venison. Historians still argue whether that was supposed to taste like deer, or if the monk who wrote it had simply given up on clarity. As you walk deeper into the field, you spot a peasant woman sitting on an upturned bucket. She's peeling parsnips with a knife that's seen better centuries. Her hands are swift, sure, the motion rhythmic and hypnotic. She tells you without looking up that these roots are best after the first frost, when the starches convert to sugars. That cold snap turns them tender and sweet, the culinary equivalent of a personality makeover. She points to a few odd-looking parsnips with bulbous tops and forked roots. Bad soil, she says. Too many stones. You notice they resemble stubby dancers frozen mid-kick. In this world, parsnips don't need to be perfect, just edible. You reach into a woven basket nearby and find that parsnips were often dried and ground into a coarse flour, sometimes mixed with barley to make dense winter bread. It wasn't exactly sourdough-level artistry, but it filled the belly and left enough sweetness behind to justify chewing. A fringe belief from an obscure Polish manuscript claimed parsnip flour boosted memory, though strangely the text itself forgets to explain why. The air shifts slightly. A young boy trudges past, carrying a jug filled with parsnip wine. Yes, that's a thing. fermented root sap mixed with herbs and left to bubble away in dark corners. It was weak, cloudy, and just enough to make your uncle tell the same story 4 times. The woman smirks, watching the boy go. "Best drink it before it thinks too much," she says, and returns to peeling. As you step out of the field and onto a dirt road lined with wild mustard, the sun tries to pierce through the clouds, briefly lighting up a trail of parsnip tops swaying gently in the breeze. These plants were more than food. They were a sign that your land was at least tolerable, your harvest likely, and your winter a little less grim. Nobles may have dined on imported almonds and salted pheasant, but the common folk feasted on what their soil allowed. And for many that meant parsnips. You arrive at a market stall covered in burlap. A weathered man, more wrinkles than skin, offers you a bowl of warm parsnip mash. He says it's seasoned with salt and wild thyme. You taste it. It's creamy, a little fibrous, with a surprisingly sweet finish. He tells you parsnips were once fed to livestock until someone no one remembers who decided to try one themselves. That person was either very brave or very hungry, or both. Next to the stall is a small pile of burnt black sticks. You ask. He shrugs. Dried parsnip peels once used as kindling or even rough toothbrushes. No one enjoyed it. No one questioned it. Hygiene was relative. A particularly quirky tidbit you overhear from a neighboring merchant involves parsnip poultices used to ease fevers. The merchant swears her grandmother cured a cousin's hiccups with a parsnip strapped to the chest with goose fat. It's not science, she says, but it's tradition. You nod slowly, resisting the urge to ask follow-up questions. Some medieval scholars speculated whether parsnips once held sacred meaning, especially due to their sweet taste and underground nature. One tattered monk's journal claimed the plant hid its goodness beneath the earth, like the soul beneath flesh. That monk either knew something profound or had been sampling too much parsnip wine. Historians, as you might guess, still argue about it. You walk on the gentle breeze, carrying with it the smell of soil, distant firewood, and the faint sweetness of root vegetables roasting somewhere behind a thatched cottage. There's something oddly comforting in it, an invisible thread tying you to centuries of cold mornings, worn hands, and humble dinners scraped from the earth. The path narrows again, and ahead you spot another plot of strange-looking crops, tangled and stringy like they're trying to crawl back underground. You sigh. More vegetables. But that's what you came for. After all, you're not here for adventure or treasure, just the forgotten flavors of a world that once fed itself with things most of us wouldn't recognize today. You reach the edge of the next field and brace yourself. The field before you looks like it's been abandoned by time itself. Sparse stalks jut out at odd angles, knotted together by thin roots and crowned with limp white flowers. You step in cautiously, brushing aside the damp leaves, and find yourself eye to eye with one of medieval farming's strangest residents, skirret. You probably haven't heard of it. Most people haven't. It sounds like the name of an elf or a minor curse, but no, it's a vegetable. Or more accurately, a mess of skinny white roots trying their best to be useful. You crouch down and start digging with your fingers. Skirret doesn't grow like a proud carrot or dramatic parsnip. It grows in clusters like a bunch of tangled shoelaces that forgot their purpose. The roots snap easily, some turning soft and spongy in your hand. One tastes vaguely like sweet celery, another like parsley if parsley was raised in a cave. The taste is odd, subtle, and somehow comforting, especially if you've been chewing on raw turnip all morning. Skirret was once considered a delicacy in royal courts. Medieval texts mention it boiled roasted or mashed into puddings and served during feasts alongside meats, with names that now feel illegal. Historians still argue whether it was native to Northern Europe or introduced via Roman occupation. The Romans, of course, had a habit of dragging obscure crops across entire continents like botanical luggage. A young monk once described skirret as a root with sweetness, hidden in string, and frankly, that sums it up. The roots are so fibrous that even medieval recipes written by people who casually ate squirrel warn you to peel them carefully. You picture some poor apprentice in a smoky kitchen, squinting in candlelight, trying to separate skirret strands like he's defusing a vegetable bomb. You wander through rows of the plant, and at the far edge of the field, you find a small wooden sign scratched with the words, "For stew and scripture only." It's leaning against a crumbling wall near a monastery garden. Skirret was commonly grown in monastic plots, likely because monks had the time and the patience to deal with something that took forever to prep and still tasted like vegetable afterthought. But it had its moments. There's a story quirky, possibly fictional, but repeated enough to feel real, that a group of monks in Kent once used skirret as penance food. The idea was that its stringy, tedious texture would remind them of the tangled sins of man. Each bowl had to be chewed 30 times before swallowing. It's unclear whether this helped with salvation digestion or simply bored them into silence. You pass a low bench where an old man is carving skirret roots into tiny figurines. He hands you one shaped like a fox. "They used to think these had magic," he mutters. "You dry 'em right, put 'em under your pillow, and you won't dream of fire." You nod politely, tucking the root fox into your coat, like you know what any of that means. One fringe used for skirret shows up in a dusty Italian farming guide circa 1300, pickled in vinegar, wrapped in honey-soaked cloth and stuffed into goosenecks for roasting. It was meant to impress guests or confuse them. Either worked. As you walk farther, you notice how few of these plants are left. A passing farmer shakes his head. "Too much work," he says. "No one has time for food that fights back." He's not wrong. Skirret fell out of favor as other easier crops took over. Potatoes, latecomers to the European vegetable party, eventually stomped out anything that required this level of fiddling. Still, there's a charm to it. The fact that someone somewhere spent half a day peeling these things just to make a side dish tells you something about perseverance or boredom. Maybe both. You glance back at the bench where the old man is now whittling a skirret into the shape of a cathedral. You're impressed, also confused, but mostly impressed. The sky grows darker as a light drizzle begins adding a shimmer to the plants around you. You pluck one final root from the ground, give it a sniff, and tuck it into your pocket. Not for eating, just for company. Because if skirret's good for anything, it's reminding you that even the weird, tangled, forgotten bits of history once mattered enough to grow. Ahead, the path turns, framed by rows of overgrown hedges and the low hum of bees circling unseen blossoms. A faint herbal scent floats on the breeze, something bitter, ancient, and slightly judgmental. You recognize it immediately. The Romans brought it. The medieval cooks tolerated it. And you, lucky traveler, are about to meet Alexander's. You round the bend and walk straight into a cloud of sharp green scent. It hits your nose with a mixture of celery, parsley, and something vaguely medicinal like a salad trying too hard. You part the tall, glossy stalks and find yourself in the middle of a forgotten Roman hand-me-down Alexander's. The name alone sounds regal, maybe even a bit dramatic. But make no mistake, this isn't fine cuisine. This is the ancient Mediterranean, pretending it still matters in northern mud. You pluck a leaf and roll it between your fingers. The texture is waxy, almost rubbery, and the smell intensifies bitter brash, slightly offensive. You pop a piece in your mouth. It tastes like celery if celery had been left out in the rain and developed an attitude. No wonder this vegetable never made it onto charcuterie boards. Originally introduced by the Romans Alexander's Smyrnium olusatrum, if you're feeling botanical, were once the height of cultivated greenery. Before modern celery became a thing, this was what you sprinkled into soups, shoved into meat pies, or boiled into submission for anything resembling a meal. The name itself comes from the city of Alexandria. And yes, historians still argue whether that's due to actual trade routes or just ancient branding nonsense. You pass a crumbling stone sign covered in lichen. The words are almost unreadable, but a carved stalk tells you this garden once belonged to a manor kitchen. Nobles grew Alexanders in large quantities, mostly to show they were still somewhat in touch with Roman refinement. But even peasants used it, they just didn't pretend to enjoy it. Medicinal texts touted its uses for warming the stomach and moving the bowels. In other words, if you couldn't go, Alexanders would make sure you did. You duck under an arch of trellised vines and overhear two women arguing over the plant's uses. One insists it cures toothaches. The other says it wards off evil dreams. Both are chewing it like gum. You try not to make eye contact. In some fringe parts of medieval England, it was believed that carrying a stalk of Alexanders would keep you from getting lost in the woods. Odd, considering this plant prefers to grow on coastal cliffs and abandoned abbeys, not forests. But hey, medieval logic rarely got in the way of a good superstition. As you wander, you find more parts of the plant, black seeds that smell like licorice hollow stems, once used as makeshift straws, and thick roots that look suspiciously like horseradish. In fact, the whole thing was edible from flower to root, though whether that was a blessing or a cruel joke remains unclear. There's a whisper of salt in the breeze now. You realize you're close to the sea. Alexanders often grow near coastlines, thriving in that damp, saline air that kills off more delicate crops. Monks once foraged it, by the armful, dragging it back to stone kitchens, where it was chopped into stews alongside fish or boiled oats. A 12th century recipe from a Yorkshire priory included Alexander's eel and sour beer. The dish was supposedly called fisherman's comfort. You doubt the comfort part. You pause by a small hut, its wooden walls bowing slightly under the weight of age and the sea wind. An old man inside waves you over. He's grinding Alexander seeds into a fine powder with a stone pestle. "For my knees," he says. "And the rats?" You blink. He gestures to a row of small cloth pouches hanging from a beam. Keeps them away, or maybe just makes them angrier. He laughs toothless and wheezing, then hands you a pinch of the powder. It smells like licorice, and Pepper had an awkward child. In some regions, Alexanders were pickled in vinegar and stuffed into fish before roasting. In others, the stalks were candied in honey for medicinal use. You imagine biting into one sweet on the outside, aggressively herbal within. Kind of like medieval candy corn, but less festive and more likely to make you gag. You step back outside and notice the sun is starting to dip lower, casting gold over the sea in the distance. The Alexanders sway proud and slightly pompous, as if they know they were once Roman imports, now demoted to coastal weeds. They've outlived empires, plagues, and the arrival of tastier vegetables simply because they're too stubborn to disappear. A nearby child runs past, waving a bundle of the stalks like a sword. You hear her yell something about monster breath before vanishing behind a dune. Somewhere between forgotten crop and playground prop, Alexanders have found a strange immortality. You chew one last leaf, it still tastes awful, and move on. Ahead, the landscape grows wilder. You see low hills dotted with sheep, and beyond them patches of green so bright they almost glow. It's a different kind of edible. One that stings a bit if you're not careful. But it's beloved by peasants, feared by goats, and named after a king. You head toward it, brushing Alexanders from your sleeves, like the memory of an awkward dinner guest who overstayed their welcome. The sheep scatter lazily as you approach the field, barely bothering to lift their heads. Ahead, the land softens into a gentle slope sprinkled with long green stalks that sway like reeds in a dream. You bend down, reaching through the grass, and your fingers brush against broad leaves dusted with morning dew. Then, zap. A sting sharp and sudden bites your skin. You yelp under your breath. You've just met one of the medieval countryside's most underrated vegetables, Good King Henry. Yes, that's its real name. Good King Henry. Sounds like a fairy tale monarch who feeds his subjects well and dies nobly in a war against boredom. In reality, it's a scruffy, stinging weed that once fed thousands. A kind of wild spinach that made its way into medieval kitchens out of sheer necessity and surprising taste. You rub the sting from your hand and peer closer. The leaves are wide and spade-shaped with a dull green tone that looks slightly ashamed of itself. But don't let appearances fool you. This so-called poor man's asparagus was loved for its versatility. You could steam the leaves, fry the young shoots, or even grind the seeds into a flour so coarse it could ruin both your bread and your mood. Peasants would gather it in early spring when the fields were still waking up and proper crops were weeks from harvest. The tender shoots were boiled and served like asparagus if asparagus had a low self-esteem and a tendency to bite back. Some wealthier households even grew it, intentionally fencing off small plots to keep it away from goats. Because, for reasons unknown, goats hated this plant. Historians still argue whether it was the taste, the sting, or perhaps a vendetta from some ancient goat-weed feud lost to time. You watch an older woman carefully harvesting the shoots with gloved hands, placing them in a wide basket. She hums as she works. You ask what she's making. A pottage, she says. Leaf and lentil. You nod like you understand what that means, but your stomach gurgles in protest. Still, she offers you a nibble, just a bit of steamed Henry with salt and vinegar. It's earthy, slightly bitter, but strangely satisfying. The kind of food that doesn't try to be more than it is. A quirky little detail about Good King Henry, it wasn't just food. In some regions, it doubled as a poultice for ulcers or blisters. Boil it down, mash it into paste, and slap it on your skin. It was the medieval version of neosporin, if neosporin had a prickly attitude and occasionally smelled like damp hay. You continue walking the leaves, crunching softly beneath your boots. This vegetable had a moment in medieval England, especially in monasteries where the monks appreciated its spiritual symmetry, lowly, humble, yet nourishing. It appeared in some early herbals as Mercury's plant, supposedly tied to healing energies and celestial balance. One monk even claimed it grew best on church land. Another claimed it whispered prayers when the wind blew through its stalks. That monk was probably left alone after that. A farmer once attempted to domesticate it, fully cultivating rows of Henry-like noble spinach. But the plant was stubborn. It preferred poor soil, inconsistent watering, and neglect. The moment you tried to pamper it, it sulked. There's something oddly poetic about a vegetable that only thrives when forgotten. You spot a small cooking fire ahead with a young boy stirring a pot of bubbling greens. You sit beside him, and he grins, lifting the lid with a flourish. Inside is a thick stew of lentils, garlic, and chopped Good King Henry. He hands you a wooden spoon. The flavor is deep, bitter, rich, almost smoky. You realize this may be the medieval version of comfort food. Not luxurious, not even particularly pretty, but warm, nourishing, and honest. He tells you his grandmother used to dry the leaves for winter and grind them into meal. She'd add it to everything. He shrugs. Porridge, gruel, even beer. You raise an eyebrow. Don't ask, he says. That one didn't catch on. And yet, like so many vegetables from this era, good King Henry quietly disappeared over time, replaced by flashier greens, faster growers, and things that didn't sting you just for saying hello. But in recent years, there's been a minor resurgence among foragers and food historians. Some now call it the comeback king. You're not sure it ever left, just retreated to the hedgerows, waiting for someone to remember it. The fire crackles low as the boy begins humming an old harvest song, something about seeds and saints and 6-month winters. You lie back in the grass, the sting on your hand now just a tingle. The sky is a pale silver, and the air carries a faint metallic tang, the kind that comes before rain or after memory. Just beyond the hill, a garlicky scent cuts through the breeze. It's sharp, bold, and oddly invigorating. You sit up, curiosity tugging at your legs. Time to follow your nose, because next on your journey is a plant that walked straight out of folklore and into the medieval kitchen with the grace of a mule Ramson's. Wild garlic, the vampire slayer of the peasant garden. The scent grows stronger as you crest the hill, each step squishing softly in the mossy undergrowth. It's not the delicate kind of garlic you sprinkle over focaccia. No, this is wild garlic Ramson's, to be precise, bold, unapologetic, and probably planning to haunt your breath for days. The air is thick with its pungent perfume, like someone rubbed a clove on every tree trunk for half a mile. You descend into a shaded glade where the forest floor is carpeted with long green leaves and tiny white starbursts of flowers. The quiet here is dense, sacred. If a salad had a temple, this would be it. You kneel down and brush your hand through the leaves. They're soft, pliable, and cool to the touch. You tear one and immediately regret bringing your nose so close. The intensity is astonishing, fresh and musky like a raw onion at a Renaissance fair. This plant, beloved by medieval foragers, was both medicine and meal. You take a tentative nibble. It's spicy, almost peppery, with a sharp bite that races up your sinuses. You cough. Somewhere a squirrel stares at you with judgment. Medieval folks adored Ramson's. In springtime, it was one of the first greens to push through the thawing earth, announcing the end of the hunger season. You could toss it into pottage, chop it into stews, or smear it with lard on rough bread if you were feeling fancy. One widespread folk belief claimed it woke the blood after winter, that it stirred the soul and slapped your insides awake, like a culinary alarm clock. Historians still argue whether this referred to actual nutritional benefits or just the shock of flavor in a time of culinary blandness. A friar once wrote that Ramsons were too wild for church gardens. The smell, he said, distracts the brethren from prayer. You imagine a room full of monks trying to chant through garlic breath and try not to laugh. Still, the plant had its sacred moment. In some Slavic regions, Ramsons were placed under pillows to ward off bad dreams and evil spirits. One Bohemian herbalist swore it protected children from fairies. You're not entirely convinced. Those aren't the same thing. As you walk through the forest, your boots brushing over the leaves, you come upon a young woman gathering bunches into a cloth sack. She offers you a taste of a strange pesto Ramsons mashed with nuts, vinegar, and a whisper of dried apple. It's tangy, explosive, and surprisingly addictive. She grins. My grandmother says it keeps the suitors away. You believe her. This stuff could cancel a wedding. Nearby, an old shepherd sits by a stone, chewing Ramsons like chewing gum. Warms the bones, he mutters. And the nose. He tells you that in some villages, they used Ramsons as a test of love. Couples had to eat it together and then endure each other's breath without complaint. Survival of the most tolerant. You reach the edge of the glade and spot a half-ruined chapel overtaken by ivy. Inside, the altar is long gone, replaced by dirt, moss, and you guessed it, Ramsons growing through the cracks. Someone once tried to plant roses here. Ramsons had other plans. In monastic kitchens, wild garlic was often dried and crumbled into medicinal powders. Some believed it cured gout, others claimed it soothed coughs, and a few simply liked the taste enough to make up reasons. A fringe recipe from a Saxon scroll suggests mixing Ramsons with beer and honey to cure the trembling. No dosage was listed, which sounds risky at best. You sit on a fallen log chewing on a leaf despite yourself. The flavor dulls over time, replaced by a kind of grounding warmth. You start to understand the old beliefs. This isn't just food, it's fuel. A pungent declaration that life was coming back after winter's long silence. As the breeze shifts, it carries away the sharpness, leaving only a hint of earth and spice. In the distance, you hear the slow rhythm of someone pounding something heavy in a mortar. You rise and follow the sound, Ramsons still clinging to your breath like a stubborn memory. You pass through a narrow corridor of trees and step into a clearing where a woman in a wool apron is grinding up what looks like tall grass into a pulpy mess. She nods toward a pile of dried stalks beside her. Couch grass, she says. For coughs and, well, everything else. You blink. She shrugs. Also soup. You sigh. It's going to be another one of those vegetables. But you take a step closer anyway, because if there's one thing you've learned on this sleepy, stinky journey through medieval farming, it's that every boring weed has a story, and every forgotten root has at least one person still willing to chew it, even if it tastes like lawnmower clippings and regret. The clearing feels quieter somehow, like the plants themselves are waiting for you to say something first. You squint down at the heap of coarse stalks piled beside the mortar. Couch grass. You've stepped on it 1,000 times without a second thought. It grows everywhere, fields, roadsides, that one corner of every garden where nothing else dares to live. But here someone is treating it like treasure, or at least like something mildly useful and slightly irritating. Which coincidentally is exactly how medieval peasants felt about it. The woman continues pounding the grass with slow, deliberate thumps. Each strike releases a faintly sweet, grassy smell like a meadow exhaling after a long day. She scoops a bit of the mashed pulp into a cloth and ties it into a knot. For the chest, she mutters. Put it on, breathe it in. You nod politely, though it smells like something that could summon bees. Couch grass, also called quack grass or twitch grass, depending on who you asked and how mad they were at. It was a classic example of accidental medicine. Most people didn't grow it on purpose. It just showed up. Like moldy bread or distant relatives. It spread fast, dug deep, and fought back when you tried to yank it out. But if you boiled the roots long enough, strained the mess, and ignored the taste, it was said to help with coughs, fevers, kidney stones, and bizarrely jealousy. Historians still argue whether that last one was a metaphor or just wishful thinking. You sit on a rock and grab a stalk. It feels wiry and a bit resentful. People did eat it during famines, though not by choice. The roots could be roasted or ground into flour, although most accounts suggest the result tasted like burnt rope. Still, in years when crops failed and bellies growled, couch grass filled the void literally and emotionally. A boy runs by holding what looks like a bundle of hay, tied together with twine. My mom makes couch grass pudding, he shouts. You pause. Pudding. He stops long enough to explain it's more of a jelly, really, roots boiled with honey and thickened with oats. You nod slowly, mentally filing that under do not attempt. But hey, at least someone liked it. A quirky tidbit from an old herbal grimoire claims that if you slept with couch grass under your pillow, you'd dream of horses. The same text also says the plant could summon wind if burned on the right hill at midnight. The scientific basis for either claim remains unverified. As you poke around the base of a nearby hedge, you notice how the couch grass weaves itself around the roots of other plants, clinging and twisting, relentless in its ambition to take over everything. It's easy to see why medieval farmers hated it. Clearing a field of couch grass was a full-time job, and even then it came back angrier. But ironically, its tenacity is what made it valuable during lean years. You could ignore it for months, then remember it existed just in time to boil yourself a bitter, grassy bowl of survival. Back near the mortar, the woman has moved on to drying strands of couch grass over a low fire. She tells you the smoke helps clear the lungs, and the house she adds with a smirk. No one sticks around long when this is burning. You take a deep breath and instantly feel like you've licked the inside of a compost bin. Still, there's something weirdly comforting about it. Like everything else you've tasted, touched, and tripped over on this journey couch, grass reminds you that life didn't always come wrapped in flavor or convenience. Sometimes it came with fibrous roots and vaguely medicinal side effects. But it came, and that was enough. You rise and stretch, brushing off bits of stalk from your sleeves. A sharp breeze cuts through the clearing, rustling the leaves, and carrying with it the unmistakable smell of something cooking a little nuttier, softer, and suspiciously familiar. You follow it, your boots crunching over the dirt path as it narrows toward a thatched cottage. A clay pot simmers on the fire, and inside it, pale golden orbs bob lazily in broth. Chickpeas. Now there's a food you recognize, or do you, because these aren't served in colorful bowls with lemon zest and paprika. No food processor in sight. This is the medieval version, soaked, boiled, maybe mashed and seasoned with whatever was hanging from the rafters. Possibly dust. You step closer, the scent rising in warm, lazy waves. It's not exactly inviting, but it's solid, dependable. And it may just be the Middle Ages' best attempt at comfort food before tomatoes showed up and changed everything. The clay pot lets off a gentle hiss as a bubble breaks the surface, releasing a puff of steam that smells of onions, herbs, and something that could generously be called chickpeas. You crouch beside the fire, rubbing your hands for warmth, and peer into the broth. The peas look soft yellowish and slightly swollen, nothing like the polished little pearls you get from a tin today. These are rugged, a little wrinkly, chickpeas that have seen things. Someone hands you a ladle made from a gourd, and you sip the broth. It's bland but warm, and strangely satisfying. You taste time. Maybe some wild leek. No garlic this time, probably because the Ramsons stole the show last village over. Chickpeas, or sicer as the Romans called them, had already been around for centuries by the time medieval cooks got hold of them. But they didn't always enjoy the spotlight. In the grand vegetable drama, chickpeas were more background extras than stars. In the Middle Ages, chickpeas were mostly found in the South Spain, southern France, parts of Italy, where the climate allowed them to thrive. Farther north, they were imported or grown in small batches, usually near monasteries or experimental plots. They were hardy, easy to store, and high in protein, which made them an ideal food for fasting monks and desperate peasants alike. But let's be honest, they weren't winning any taste tests. Historians still argue whether chickpeas were seen as a peasant crop or a medicinal one. Some texts list them as a remedy for constipation. Others ironically claim they cause it. One German herbal from the 1400s describes them as windy, which you can interpret however you like. And many did. A fringe belief held that boiling chickpeas in river water and burying them under your house protected you from lightning. No explanation was provided. Just trust the process. You notice an older woman mashing some of the peas into a thick paste using a flat stone. She spreads it onto hard bread and hands you a chunk. You bite in, It's grainy, earthy, and exactly what you'd expect from a civilization that hadn't invented hummus yet. Olive oil was rare. Tahini unheard of. Garlic, if you had it, was saved for real emergencies like plagues or flavor. So this was just mashed chickpeas, maybe with salt, if you were lucky. You chew thoughtfully, pretending it's not like eating flavored sand. Despite that, people valued chickpeas deeply. Not just for their taste or lack thereof, but for their dependability. In famine years, they were traded like treasure. When fresh food was scarce, a handful of dried chickpeas could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Some households even tucked them into cloth bags as tokens of good fortune, believing the little legumes brought protection against sickness. Others just liked having something to chew on that wasn't their own frustration. In a small corner garden, you find chickpea plants growing in tight little rows. The plants are modest, short, with delicate green leaves and tiny pods hiding just 1 or 2 peas each. You pluck a pod, pop it open, and find a pea barely the size of your fingernail. It's green, fresh, and almost sweet. You wonder if this is what inspired the idea of better things to come, something small, humble, and full of quiet promise. A monk walking past sees you examining the plant. Chickpeas make the heart patient, he says, quoting a line from an old devotional cookbook. He doesn't elaborate, just keeps walking. You make a mental note to remember that one the next time you're stuck waiting for dinner. There's a story from Sicily about a cook who could predict the weather based on how chickpeas boiled. If they floated early, rain was coming. If they sank, good harvests. You try to picture a peasant staring into a pot, reading legumes like tea leaves, and nod to yourself. Sounds about right. You move back to the fire and sit beside a man stirring the pot slowly. He adds a pinch of dried mint, swirls it with care, and offers you another bowl. This one has depth, more herbs, more body. You thank him. They're better on the second day, he says. You believe him. A young girl near the hearth is playing with dried chickpeas, arranging them into patterns on a stone slab. Stars, flower spirals. You watch her quietly. In a world with no toys, no screens, even the humble chickpea could become art, or distraction, or prayer. As dusk begins to fall, the pot is lifted from the fire and set aside. The warmth lingers in your belly. It's not indulgence, not even satisfaction, but it's enough. Enough to keep going, enough to last another day. You rise and brush off your cloak. Far in the distance, you hear the distant cry of gulls and the soft crashing of waves. The air sharpens with salt. It smells like seaweed and wind and the edge of something strange. You follow the path downward toward cliffs where farmers once foraged for a crop most of us would overlook today, sea kale, a plant that grew from stone and salt and yet found its way onto both noble tables and peasant plates. You step forward, boots sinking slightly into damp earth as the smell of the sea grows stronger. The soil thins beneath your feet, giving way to gravel and sand as the wind tugs at your sleeves. You've reached the edge of the world, or so it feels. The cliffs rise like jagged teeth over the gray-green sea, and the waves below crash with that low, endless rhythm that sounds like time itself, exhaling. The air is thick with salt and seaweed, and as you peer over the edge, you spot the stubborn tufts of a vegetable that looks more like a survivor than a snack sea kale. It sprouts defiantly from crevices in the rock, its thick, pale green leaves tinged with powdery blue and curled at the edges like ancient scrolls. You slide carefully down a narrow path, carved into the cliffside, crouch low, and reach out to touch a leaf. It's waxy and cool, resilient against the wind. This was a crop the sea didn't want to give up, but medieval farmers were persistent or desperate. Probably both. Sea kale cram maritima, to the handful of botanists who still whisper its name, wasn't cultivated so much as coaxed from nature. It thrived where little else would exposed beaches, chalk cliffs, gravel beds. It wasn't something you sowed and harvested politely. It was something you found like treasure or trouble. In lean times, coastal communities gathered it in bundles, boiling the thick stalks until tender and drenching them in butter, if butter was available. If not, a sprinkle of salt and hope would do. The taste. Think of asparagus and cabbage having a slightly awkward blind date. Mild, earthy, a little sweet, not bad. Not thrilling. But in a world of boiled barley and sadness, it was practically gourmet. You see an old fisherman carving something near the rocks. As you approach, he nods toward a basket filled with fresh-cut sea kale. Picked before flowering, he says. That's the secret. Wait too long and it turns bitter as betrayal. You believe him. He offers you a piece blanched and cooled by the breeze. You chew it slowly. It has bite but also softness, like a story that's been told 100 times and still matters. Historians still argue whether sea kale was truly cultivated in the medieval period or simply gathered wild. Evidence is murky. One monastery's garden plan shows it labeled as Marina brassica, but no one agrees if that's sea kale or just another hopeful cabbage. What's clear is that by the 16th century, it was slowly becoming domesticated, making its way from cliff to cottage to court. In fact, one curious record from a 14th century coastal manor lists sea kale served with poached fish and thick mustard. It was considered elegant, exotic even. Imagine being a noble eating something your peasants had been foraging for centuries and thinking you discovered it. Classic. A fringe belief you overhear from a woman carrying sea kale in her apron. Hang the roots above your door to keep storms away. She says her grandmother swore by it. If the kale falls, the wind comes fast, she adds, then disappears around a bend before you can ask what happens if it doesn't. The tide pulls back slowly, revealing more clusters of the plant along the shore. In some coastal villages, dried sea kale leaves were used to wrap fish before baking. The result was a kind of ocean burrito rich with brine and minerals, eaten on feast days or funerals depending on the filling. You sit on a flat rock and watch the water glimmer. A small child runs past, dragging a bundle of kelp behind her. Her father follows, carrying a sack of sea kale like it's a prize. Last patch this season, he says with pride. Boil it right, it tastes like spring. Boil it wrong, it tastes like regret, he laughs. You're starting to hear that a lot. Vegetables in this era were less about taste and more about avoiding disappointment. Some monks believed sea kale cleansed the soul. One herbal manuscript from Normandy describes it as a plant of salt and silence, useful in fasting dishes and spiritual diets. The same text warns against eating too much, lest you become as stubborn as the rock it grows from. You suspect the author had a bad day in the kitchen. The sun dips lower, painting the sea with bruised gold. You gather a few leaves, fold them into your pouch, and start back up the cliff path. As you climb, the taste of the sea lingers on your tongue, clean, strange old. This was food not grown in fields, but scraped from the edges of civilization. A gift from the shore, or a challenge. At the top, the land flattens again. You wipe the salt from your eyes and spot a line of tall, feathery stalks swaying near a low stone wall. The scent is unmistakable licorice lemon and the faint promise of indigestion. Fennel, a plant so ancient it outlived empires and so useful that even medieval cooks couldn't ignore it. You sigh, stretch your back, and follow the smell. It's time to meet the most fragrant multitasker of the medieval herb world, used for flavor medicine magic, and occasionally to politely distract from the smell of your neighbors. The scent hits you before you reach the garden, sweet and sharp like licorice caught in a summer breeze. Fennel, tall, spindly stalks crowned with delicate yellow blooms, lean into the wind like they're whispering secrets to the sky. You step through a narrow gate and into a garden that looks less like a farm and more like a perfume shop lost its mind. Everything smells like something time mints sage, but fennel overpowers them all, strutting through the air like it owns the place. You run your fingers along a stem. It's smooth and firm bending without breaking. You pluck a frond and rub it between your fingers. The scent intensifies, sweet herbal, vaguely soapy. You pop it into your mouth. It tastes like licorice had a spa day. This wasn't just food in the Middle Ages, it was a declaration. I may not have spices from the Orient, a cook might say, but I've got fennel and it'll do. Fennel was everywhere, in stews, pies, porridges, mixed with beans to cut the flatulence. This was a real culinary tactic, let that image settle. A monk once wrote that fennel made peas more sociable. Historians still argue whether he meant easier to digest or more pleasant to discuss over dinner. Either way, fennel got the job done. You pass a group of women chopping fennel bulbs into a wooden trough. They're preparing a dish for a holy feast, fennel and barley pottage with a drizzle of vinegar and maybe, if the Lord is feeling generous, a shred of dried apple. You're offered a spoonful. It's warm, soft, tangy. The fennel cuts through the mush with brightness. You take another bite, maybe two, then pretend it's polite to stop. A nearby boy is chewing fennel seeds like candy. "It's for my breath," he says, then grins. A lot of medieval folk used fennel seeds to mask the scent of less than stellar hygiene. You chew one. It works. Sort of. A fringe practice even involved hanging fennel over doorways to keep out evil spirits, or in some villages, tax collectors. Hard to say which was worse. In monastic medicine, fennel was a superstar. It was believed to aid digestion, cool fevers, ease childbirth, sharpen eyesight, and possibly ward off werewolves. Okay, not officially, but the list of claims was so long, it wouldn't be surprising. One Saxon nun wrote that fennel awakens the soul and softens the belly. A poetic way to say it made you feel less like dying after dinner. You sit on a bench by the herb garden, watching the golden light flicker through the fennel blossoms. The plants sway gently, rhythmic and soothing. It's almost hypnotic. A young novice walks past, carrying a bunch of stalks bound with twine. For the dormitory, he mutters. You raise an eyebrow. "Smells better than Brother Tiberius," he adds, and vanishes into the chapel. Fennel wasn't just for food and smell, it had symbolic weight. In some medieval plays and texts, it represented courage and strength. Warriors were said to chew fennel before battle, which sounds less like strategy and more like wishing on a salad. But who are we to judge? You lean back and remember that in some parts of Italy, fennel was used in wine steeped to make a digestive tonic. In France, it flavored sausage. In England, it was baked into breads and cakes. It could be chopped, roasted, steeped, or chewed raw. It was everywhere. Too useful to die out. Too strange to ignore. A woman nearby is weaving fennel stalks into a small wreath. You ask what it's for. "Funerals," she says simply. "Helps the spirit pass sweetly." You nod, unsure whether to be moved or unnerved. She places a frond behind your ear and tells you it'll keep nightmares away. You decide to believe her. And yet, despite all its glory, fennel faded a little with time. As spices became cheaper and trade routes expanded, its role shrank from hero to background character. Still important. Still there. Just less loud. Like an old friend who no longer brags, but quietly brings you soup when you're sick. You rise and stretch, brushing fennel pollen from your sleeves. In the distance, you hear laughter and the rattle of a harvest cart. The road ahead is lined with low vines and round pods, green-yellow, even a few streaked with purple. You already know what they are. Peas, but not just any peas. These are medieval peas, the kind that sparked debates, dictated planting schedules, and occasionally started arguments at markets. Because, yes, even in the age of plague and piety, people still manage to be picky about their legumes. And you're about to find out just how deep that rabbit hole goes. You follow the sound of rattling wheels until it leads you to a sun-dappled clearing just off the main path. Here peas sprawl like gossip across rows of low trellises, their delicate tendrils curling around sticks and strings like they're plotting something. You pause at the edge, watching a man stoop to inspect the pods. He frowns at one, grunts at another, and finally holds up a plump green one with a look of triumph, like he's just found the holy grail of legumes. You step into the raw's boots crunching over dry soil. The plants brush against your legs, with whisper-soft leaves and the occasional stubborn vine. Some of the pods are long and straight. Others are short and swollen, split at the seams, like they've been holding in secrets too long. You pluck one, pop it open, and taste a single round pea. It's starchy, earthy, with a hint of sweetness, but not much. This isn't your modern sugar snap. It's a medieval field pea. The kind meant to survive storage, not to make your salad pretty. In medieval Europe, peas weren't just peas. They were a way of life, and sometimes a point of contention. Historians still argue whether the so-called garden peas used in spring dishes were cultivated separately from their tougher cousins, the field peas, stored dry for winter. One was soft, fresh, a treat. The other hard as optimism in February. You pass two farmers mid-debate, gesturing dramatically at sacks of dried peas. One insists his peas sprout faster. The other claims hers don't smell like regret. They both wave you away when you ask what they actually do with them. Fair enough, you'll figure it out yourself. At a nearby cottage, a woman is boiling a pot of pea porridge over an open flame. The smell wafts through the air, savory, thick with notes of onion, maybe leek, and the unmistakable hint of something that's been reheated too many times. She ladles you a scoop. It slides onto your trencher like green cement. You take a bite. It's warm, slightly salty, and it coats your tongue like it's planning to move in. It's not bad. It's not good. It's just sustaining. In years of bad harvests, peas became a dietary anchor. Dried, soaked overnight, and boiled into oblivion. Sometimes with herbs, sometimes with broth, and sometimes with nothing but a prayer. A fringe tradition in one Welsh village involved whispering your wishes into the pot as it cooked. Peas, remember, they'd say. No one could explain what they remembered or if you wanted them to. And while peas weren't flashy, they were important. A standard medieval farming rotation often included them to enrich the soil with nitrogen, though no one back then could have told you what nitrogen was. They just knew the land needed a break, and peas gave it one. You could call them the unsung heroes of medieval agriculture, or just the edible side of crop rotation. You reach into a basket of dried peas and scoop up a handful. They're smooth beige and oddly satisfying to hold. A nearby girl is threading them onto a string with a bone needle. For counting prayers, she tells you, and fidgeting. You smile. Even then, people needed something to do with their hands. You hear a rustle and look up to see a young man balancing two large sacks over his shoulders. Market day, he groans. Better get a good price, or my wife will feed me pea stew all week. You wish him luck. He mutters something about bandits preferring gold to legumes, but not always. As you make your way back through the rows, you notice a patch of odd-colored pods, darker, almost purplish. You ask a nearby monk about them. He tells you they're a variety from the east, said to bring dreams when eaten fresh. Good dreams, you ask. He shrugs. Depends on your sins. Classic monk answer. You sit for a moment on an overturned crate, watching the late sun filter through pea blossoms. The light flickers softly across the field, casting long shadows and warming the tips of the vines. There's something peaceful about it. The rhythm of growing things. The simplicity of planting, waiting, harvesting. The quiet joy of one more meal from the earth. A soft breeze picks up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and warm soil. In the distance, you hear the creak of a cellar door and the low murmur of voices. You rise slowly and follow the path, leaving the peas behind. The road dips downward, winding toward a darker corner of the village, where the real secrets of food survival live. Because growing vegetables was only half the battle, the other half storing them, hiding them from rats, mold, and misfortune. And in that silent underground world of root cellars, some vegetables lasted the winter, others vanished forever. You step toward the low stone doorway, its frame cool with moss, and descend into the forgotten archives of medieval taste, the place where food either endured or was erased. You duck beneath the low lintel of the cellar entrance shoulders, brushing against cold stone. The air shifts instantly cooler, heavier, damp, with the scent of earth mildew and something vaguely pickled. The world above fades behind you, replaced by shadows and the quiet murmur of preservation. This is where medieval vegetables came to hide from time, where roots curled into darkness and waited out the hunger months. You take a cautious step forward, eyes adjusting, boots crunching softly on the straw-covered floor. Welcome to the root cellar. The space is narrow and low-ceilinged, carved halfway into the ground, lined with shelves and bins. There are baskets of shriveled carrots, bundles of drying herbs, and hanging onions like clusters of dusty planets. Potatoes, surprisingly, are missing. They hadn't made their grand entrance into Europe yet, not until the 16th century. So the medieval world relied on what it could grow locally and stash safely: beets, turnips, parsnips, leeks, cabbage, and a surprising number of things that now only appear on quiz shows. You pass a crate filled with scorzonera, an odd black-skinned root that looks like something dredged up from a swamp. In its time, it was known as a poor man's oyster. You sniff it. It smells more like wet cardboard and regret. A nearby jar holds what might be preserved skirret, floating in brine. The liquid winks at you suspiciously. You decide not to touch it. A man crouches near the wall, inspecting a stack of straw-packed crates. He's checking for rot. You join him. He shows you a good King Henry root, gone soft, shrugs, and tosses it into a bin marked for pigs. Not everything survives the winter, and some things frankly aren't worth saving. Historians still argue whether these storage techniques were more guesswork than strategy. Some cellars were lined with lime or ash to deter pests. Others relied on sheer luck and cold air. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. Because once the last leaves had fallen and snow dusted the fields, the only thing standing between a family and starvation was this subterranean pantry. You crouch beside a barrel of fermented kale stalks. The smell is powerful, like someone argued with a cabbage and lost. A woman near the far wall is wrapping parsnips in cloth. She tells you her grandmother believed wrapping roots in wool kept them from shriveling. And from gossip, she adds with a wink. You nod, as if that makes sense. One corner of the cellar houses forbidden fare vegetables that vanished from records, were banned, or just abandoned. A bin labeled knapweed bulbs is covered in dust. Another holds a tangled knot of dried Alexanders, brittle, forgotten, and possibly poisonous. You peer into a sack marked only with a cross and find something that looks like a cross between a radish and a threat. You close it gently. There are legends too, vegetables spoken of in whispers said to have existed once, and then vanished. A Flemish story tells of a root so sweet it cured heartbreak, but so difficult to grow it disappeared after one bad harvest. A monk's diary mentions the singing bulb eaten on feast days and believed to inspire visions. No one knows what it was. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. A fringe belief in a Cornish village once held that certain vegetables should never be stored underground or their spirit would sour and spoil the rest. Chickpeas in particular were sometimes stored in attics instead. You glance around. No chickpeas here, just as well. You lean against the stone wall, the cool seeping through your coat. There's something timeless about this place. Not because it's beautiful, it's not, but because it's honest. This is survival, not ceremony. A root cellar doesn't care about flavor or fame. It cares about staying. And in a world full of floods, frost, and famine, staying was everything. Above your head, you hear footsteps. Life continues on the surface, the planting, the gathering, the laughter and loss. But down here, beneath the noise, vegetables lie in wait, holding their breath, preserving the taste of months long gone. You run your hand over the rough wall, then turn to leave. The stairs creak as you ascend each step, pulling you closer to warmth, to firelight, to the soft rustle of sleep beginning to settle over the land. And so we come to the end of our slow, earthy journey through forgotten vegetables, muddy fields, smoky kitchens, and root cellars full of half-remembered hope. Before you go, sit with the silence for a moment longer. The past isn't gone. It's just sleeping. Now take a long, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen, your eyes grow heavier. Picture the glow of the hearth, still warming the corner of the peasant's hut, the stew gently bubbling with parsnips and fennel. The root cellar door now closed behind you, soft earth muffling every sound. Even the wind has grown quiet. Out in the distance, the sea laps against the cliffs. The scent of sea kale lingers in the air, like a memory. Ramsons drift through the trees in your mind, but their sharpness has faded. Everything has softened now. The wild greens have been gathered, and the barrels filled the baskets, stacked neatly by the door. Nothing left to pick. Nothing left to store. Just silence, and the slow, patient hum of a world at rest. Imagine yourself lying down on a straw-filled mattress. Your blanket smells faintly of thyme and wood smoke. The walls are thick, keeping out the wind. You can hear the faint creak of beams overhead, the breath of someone sleeping in the next room, the slow drip of rain into a barrel outside. All the vegetables you've met tonight, humble, bitter, strange, have done their work. They've fed, they've healed, they've lasted. Just like you. There's nothing more to do now. No more to learn, no more to forage. Just the quiet certainty that life somehow goes on. Rooted in soil, wrapped in wool, cradled in darkness, waiting for spring. So close your eyes. Let go of the journey and sleep slow, deep, and undisturbed like a parsnip under frost.